without any further ado, let's get going here. And we're going to just start off a little bit with the idea of star trails. We're going to talk a little bit about what they are, how you capture them, where and why you would capture them. The main thing that we want to talk about here is when you're talking about any kind of night photography, the darker the skies, the better. We deal with a constant problem of light pollution, and that is measured in something called the Bortle scale. The Bortle scale goes from 1 to 9. If you look on this chart, you'll see that it is, excuse me, that it is 1 is the darkest sky, 9 is basically you're in Times Square. And around here, we usually are in the 5 or 6, a bright sky, a suburban sky. There are areas in New York State that you can get down into the 4s and even the 3s when you're talking about this Bortle scale. And obviously, the darker the skies, if you're out west, if you're in Nevada, if you're in out in big sky country, anywhere away from any kind of a city or any bright lights, any concentration of bright lights, you're going to get results from that dark sky in the 1 or 2 or 3 range that is going to give you pure blacks. You're going to be able to see more actual stars, and you're going to get better results. Around here, we do have a few places around here. One that everybody seems to know about and is great for both Milky Way shots and any kind of night sky photography is down at Hemlock Lake. It's a relatively short drive, maybe 45 minutes, easy enough to find. We have people going out there all the time, especially this time of year. And that dark sky area that you see here, right where Hemlock Lake is, it borders on in the Bortle scale, it borders on a level 3, which is pretty good for this area. But I also want to point out, if you notice up on the lake, out around just north of Albion, there is an equally dark area. The difference is that the direction that you're facing. In Hemlock Lake, you're going from a level 4 to a level 3, which means you're shooting into a darker area sky. If you're up around Hamlin and north of Albion, you're shooting north and you're shooting again into a darker area of the sky. And that'll give you some excellent star trails. You can get star trails basically anywhere. The more or the darker it is, the more prominent they'll be, the more stars you'll be able to see, the more trails you'll be able to see. However, in this area, anywhere up on the lakeshore, a little bit away from the city, from about Manitou on over, you'd be able to get some pretty good star trails. So around the Rochester area, around New York, just south of here, it's actually about a 3-hour drive. There is a dark sky site in Pennsylvania, up in the mountains. There's a little park there that you can go to, and it gives you phenomenal dark skies. Same thing up in the Adirondacks. There's several campgrounds that are in a 2 or a 3 area dark sky, and then up north in Canada, obviously. But I would highly recommend, if you want a good resource for star trails and any kind of astrophotography, I highly recommend a gentleman by the name of Ian Norman. He has a site, lonelyspec.com. He specializes in astrophotography, Milky Way photography, star trails, has some great articles, some great videos, does a really, really great job in presenting the information. And I'm going to be using some of his stuff, and I'll show you when it's from him. Other photopills.com, they are they created the PhotoPills app, which is excellent, gives you great information, and they're constantly improving it. But there's also some great tutorials on photopills.com. The Photographer's Ephemeris, TPE, similar to PhotoPills. PhotoPills seem to have more of a team behind it as opposed to TPE, which seems to be just a few people that support that, and it does a great job. Dark Site Finder helps you to locate and find a dark site, maybe where you're traveling to, where you're going on vacation. Photographing space, again, some great articles and great tutorials. Star trails, basically, the Earth's moving around, the Earth's rotating, and the stars seem to move. They are moving, and they're moving at a ridiculously fast speed, but they're so far away that they appear really stationary. But because we're moving relatively faster in our rotation, you can actually see that star move across the sky. And the idea with star trails is that you capture multiple images of that star as it progresses across the sky, anywhere from maybe an hour to, I've seen them go all night long, where it's 5 or 6 or 8 hours long, and you can get dramatic star trails. I'm going to show you some examples of different types of star trails. And again, before I started doing this and started researching it, I had no idea, because most of the star trail shots that I had seen were fall into that first category called circumpolar, where they circle around Polaris, the North Star, but there's these other two also, and I'll show you some examples. This graphic kind of describes it. And again, these are from the Northern Hemisphere. In the Northern Hemisphere, let me let Pete in here. Go ahead. All righty. In the Northern Hemisphere, hello, Pete, how you doing? And I'm going to mute you, if you don't mind. There we go. Okay. So in the Northern Hemisphere, you have this circumpolar based around the North Star. If you're pointing northeast, if you're shooting northeast, it'll have this upward angular motion. Same thing if you're pointing east, it'll be even more angular. And as you see in this chart, it'll give you these different trails, different directions that they'll be going based on the direction that you're facing. So if you wanted to get some star trails that are going almost straight down, you'd point to the west. And as you go to the northwest, they'll be a little bit more angled. So you can use that and plan out how you want your star trails to look. And again, this is from the Northern Hemisphere. I'll show you some samples. These are not ones that I take, but they're examples of pointing in different directions and the different kinds of star trails that you can find. So, the celestial equator, that equator, the Northern Hemisphere versus Southern Hemisphere in the night sky, that will give you a perfectly straight line. Everything further north than that is going to be curved upward to the left, and south of that is going to be curved down to the right. I'm just going to go through quickly and show you some of these examples that I saw and was able to collect, taken at different points. This is from the PhotoPill site, taken at different points around the world, that will show you the different shapes of star trails that you can get. And you'll notice in almost all of these, it's not just pictures of stars. There's almost always something included in the picture to include the in the foreground. Excuse me. And that will really helps to cement it. It helps to give you some context. Hello, Amy, how you doing? And in these different types of star trails, you'll notice that whether it's a landscape or a piece of architecture, something included in the foreground to give you a sense of scale is always helpful. It's just a great compositional element. And you'll see whether it's vertical or a horizontal landscape, it's something that you're gonna enjoy seeing when it has context with those stars. And you'll notice that it can be a combination of daylight moving into night or night moving into daylight. You can get all kinds, because it's basically over time, you can get some very different looking effects. So this idea of the star trails, where you've got just this sweeping loop of stars, and again, depends on what direction you're facing, and it depends on where you are compared to the equator. Further north you get, the sharper the curves get. The further south you get, closer to the equator, the more straight the lines will become. So, and for instance, in that particular photograph here, you've got a mirror with that lake in the foreground. It's a great compositional element. And again, you've got a rock pointing at the North Star. Great composition. Okay, combined with northern lights through an arch, naturally framed. Uh, the broader, the wider the panorama that you have, the more that you can include not only the North Star, that upper left corner, going through that equator, the celestial equator, where that bright white angle is to the right, and then continuing on down. This is probably a 10 exposure light panorama that includes probably 20 to 30 shots, probably closer to 100 shots for each panel. So there's all kinds of ways you can combine this to get a different look to your star trails. Framing it within a natural frame is always a unique, cool look to it. And again, you can light paint it. You've got a tree in the foreground here. Somebody hit it with a flashlight. That tree is centered underneath the North Star. Gives you a great representation. This is an extremely wide panorama, and I read the details about how this was shot. This is basically a 180-degree panorama, extremely wide lens and multiple shots stitched together and then processed together from the North Star going all the way to the southern opposite end of the scale. Okay. Very, very cool photograph, and also including that reflection of the lake in the foreground. Very cool photograph. It almost looks like some of the paintings you've seen with this kind of a swirl in it. I forget who it is. I think it's Van Gogh maybe that had something that looked like this. I think they were trying to replicate that. So the idea here, having a foreground element of some kind, gives you additional compositional interest. Okay, so before you head out and you want to do star trails, let's go over a few things you want to make sure you get done before you get out there where it's nice and dark. You're going to make sure you're setting up your camera. Let me switch here. There we go. You want to set up your camera inside, so you've got all your settings set the way you want, and I'll tell you about how you can figure out some of those. You want to figure out, using something like photo pills, where you want to stand, what direction you're going to be looking at. Use an app to find that out, to figure out, are there any buildings on the horizon? Is there going to be any kind of bright lights on the horizon that is going to affect these star trails? Because again, this is going to you're going to be taking pictures from anywhere from 45 minutes to a couple hours, depending on how many images you want. You can set it up and just leave your camera set up and let it shoot away one every 30 seconds if you want, or one a minute, however often you want, and just let it go either till your battery dies or till you figure you have enough pictures. Quite honestly, you only need about maybe 100 photographs. You can do it with less. I'll show you an example when near the end of this. We're going to use 25 pictures. We'll get star trails. I'll show you what it'll look like. So the more shots you've got, the longer those trails will be. I'll show you an example I did with about 560 shots. Again, I put my camera out at, I think it was 8:30 at night in beginning of March, and just let it keep on shooting. I told it just keep shooting until the two batteries in the camera died. They stopped around 1:30 in the morning, and I got about 570 shots. Picked up the camera in the morning and nice and frosty, and let it dry out and warm up, and then started processing the pictures. You don't need that many at all. I just wanted to see how long the camera would actually last. But 100 to 200 pictures is more than enough to get a really dramatic star trail. Okay. Preferably, you don't want the moon interfering with your shot. It's going to change the exposure, especially if it's coming into your view. It's going to blow out all the stars because you're exposing for the night sky and the stars, not for the moon. So it's going to come, if it crosses into your path, it's going to look like the sun is crossing in front of your stars. So we want to do it either with no moon, or before the moon rises, or after the moon sets. So again, photo pills will help you figure that out. As far away from the lights as you can get. I'll show you an example. You don't have to go far. I did it in my backyard. The first time I tried it, I did it in my backyard. You can get great star trails in your backyard. Now, the composition isn't great. I wasn't trying for composition. I was trying for, how do I do this? How do I set up my camera? And I'll show you those in a few minutes. But you can do it almost anywhere. If you've got a clear view of the night sky, you can get star trail pictures. Unless you're in Times Square, then you probably won't. Okay? You absolutely have to have a tripod. You want to make sure it's sturdy. You want to make sure it's level. If there's any breeze at all, you want to weight down your tripod. Either you can get, I've seen people bring a milk jug full of water, hang that on that center hook, works great. Another thing, take your camera strap off your camera. Any wind at all is going to shake that. And when you have a 30-second exposure, any movement at all is going to show up, and you'll end up with blurry star trails. Nothing, you know, you want nice sharp images. So sturdy level tripod, a wide angle lens, 24 millimeter is about as you know, that's the start of where you want to be. An 18 millimeter, 14 millimeter wide angle lens is even better. But the wider the better, because you're going to get more of that expanse. You can do panoramic shots, but whether it involves two cameras at once or through the night and actually taking additional pictures, you can certainly do that too. Alrighty, you're going to manual focus. A couple things. Your camera will not be able to focus, period. There's nowhere near enough light for it to focus. And you want to be in manual mode. You're not going to be able to use the light meter, and we'll give you some basic settings. Hello, Margie. We're going to have some basic settings for you to use so that you can get a decent exposure right at the get-go. Okay, so you're going to manual focus. Now, what I do, and this is just what I've learned after doing it several times, is I'll take my camera out like now where it's still light out, and I'll find something as far away as I can. I'll put it on a tripod, find something as far away as I can, and I'll magnify that image in the live view on the LCD in the back, and I'll fine tune the focus until whatever it is, the farthest thing at the other end of my street, I'll focus on that. When it's focused, I'll take a piece of tape and I'll tape the lens down, the focus ring, so that it can't move. Now, most wide angle lenses focus at infinity after about 20 to 30 feet. So anything past 20 or 30 feet, and most of your lenses will have a marking on it of what their furthest distance is. 20 or 30 feet away, it's always going to focus at infinity anyway. So what you want to do is find that infinity mark, and it's never going to be the mark that's actually on your lens. You want to look at your image and make sure it's sharp on something that's 40 to 50 feet away or further. Once it's sharp, lock it down. That will ensure that you're going to be focused at infinity no matter what. Okay, that is a great tip. You can try and focus. There's a little filter you can get that has slits on it that allows you to focus on a star. It splits the star into two and you bring it together when you focus. You can do that, but you're always going to be focusing at infinity. Period. You're always going to be focusing at infinity. So if you lock your lens down at infinity and you're crystal clear on what that is, and you taped it down so it can't move, you're golden. You don't have to nuts around with anything trying to focus on a dim star or even a bright light at the other end of the lake. You don't have to bother with that. You'll know that your infinity mark is dead nuts on. Okay, so after that, then you're going to set up wherever it is. Now, this is my backyard. This was the very first time I was taking some pictures. It was last year in March, and I said, "Oh, great! I'm gonna try this. I'm gonna set up in my backyard, use a nice wide-angle lens." I didn't really think about the composition. I just wanted to try and get the exposure right. So, set it up in the backyard. I got some stars, but I'll show you what happened here. I also took those images and I put them into a time lapse. What you can't control is clouds coming into your picture. It wipes out your picture. And I didn't know this until after I got all the pictures in, and oh, well, thanks a lot. Okay, so, all right. Well, we learned something from that one. Move on to the next attempt. Now, this is, again, in my backyard, pointing north. That's the North Star right there in the middle. used my 24-70 Tamron lens at 24 millimeter, 30 seconds, f4, ISO 800. Now, notice it's an f2.8 lens. I shot it at f4 because on every lens, with the exception of the highest quality Zeiss lens or the super really expensive Canon or Nikon lenses, every lens will perform better when it's stopped down a little bit. The edges will be sharper because when it's wide open, it's using all of the glass in the lens. However, if you want to get as sharp a picture as you can, edge to edge, you'll stop it down 1.5, 2 stops. That will get rid of any of those aberrations that are, or the distortions that happen when lenses are opened wide open. And that's true even if you're shooting with a 1.4 lens. And the best astrophotography lens going is I think it's a 24 millimeter f1.4 lens. There's a couple different people that make them. But everybody that I looked at, when they shot, they'd shoot at 2.8 or 3.5, stop down a little bit so that you don't have the blurry edges on the very, very outside of the image. So just a hint, you can shoot wide open. You'll let in more light. You can knock your ISO down a little bit. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But at ISO 800 on my D6400, my D810, you would be hard pressed to see any grain in that image. So going to ISO 800 and being able to shoot at f4 gives me sharp images, great dynamic range, and the exposure that I need at 30 seconds. Okay. And now the idea here is that you're trying to get star trails, which is the opposite of when we're doing Milky Way photography. And that is that you're trying to eliminate star trails. So you're trying to find that magic point where you're letting in the most light possible, but you're not getting star trails. You don't want that in a Milky Way shot, but we're trying to get that. So a 30-second exposure, which is usually the maximum for most people's camera built into the camera, the timer that's built in there, 30 seconds is usually the maximum. You can use an external timer. You can use an app that'll fire your camera. You can do it a variety of ways, but a 30-second exposure twice a minute gives you 2 shots a minute and lets in plenty of light, gives you plenty of exposure for almost any star out there. So no need to hook up anything extra unless you really want to. But this is, again, from my backyard and with that exposure. And again, I wasn't going for composition. I just wanted to try and get this effect so that when I go out remotely somewhere, whether it's the shore of Lake Ontario or Hemlock Lake or anywhere else, I've got the process down and I'll get a better composition than the back of my neighbor's house. Hey, but you can do the same thing. It'll help you improve your process. Okay, so that aside, alrighty. Okay. There are multiple programs you can use. Registax is a free program. I'll show you how to use it when we're done here at the end of this. Registax allows you to create these star trails, both with this comet look to them, and we'll show you there's some options you can have, or you can make them solid lines. But this is one of the effects, and you can then take those images and put them into an editing program and make it into a time-lapse movie, which is kind of cool. Shows it some actual motion. So again, this is the 500 and some pictures, and I'll show you a chart here once we get going. It can take a while. It might take upwards of half an hour to process that many pictures. It's overkill, quite honestly. You only need 100 to 200 at most to get a good effect. This is another program called Sequator. It does a decent job. It doesn't have anywhere near as many options as Registax does, but it does work. Registax also requires you to use JPEGs. So you need to process them in Lightroom first, get them looking the way you want, and we'll talk about some of those settings. But you need to process them in Lightroom first, then export them as JPEGs so that you can then bring them into either Sequator or Registax and let them do their work on the JPEGs. So one of the key things there is until somebody, and there may be a stacking star trails action out there for Photoshop, but I haven't seen it. Registax does an excellent job, and you can't beat the price. So when you're actually out there shooting, you want to zoom in into photo. Now on mine, I lock mine down with the piece of tape on the focus ring. I still do this step where I zoom into the photo with live view, and on every DSLR and mirrorless camera, you can zoom in. If you don't know how to do that, we can show you. It's simple enough, but you can zoom into like a 10x view, a 1-to-1 view, and you can get a single star, and you can verify that it's nice and sharp. If you want to refocus at that point, you can, but the image is terrible because it's magnifying, not only magnifying, but the camera is really straining to display anything. So the image that you'll get is extremely grainy and extremely magnified, and it's tough to focus, which is why I like to do it ahead of time. But you can check to make sure that your focus is dead nuts on with live view and with that magnification. So when you start to see fainter stars, that means that it's making those sharp. That's what you really want. That's a real clue. It'll go from a black sky to points of light. That means that it's focused even those very, 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 very faint stars. The other thing you want to do is you want to, before you start shooting, put your lens cap on, take a photograph, the same length as what you're going to do. So in most cases, a 30-second photograph of a completely black image, and do it again when you're done. The last shot, first and last shots, make them those dark frames. And what that does is Registax will use those and subtract out any heat noise or any problems with your sensor after it's been out taking 150 pictures and on. It will subtract out what is the sensor noise when there's no photons hitting it, when there's no light hitting it whatsoever. So that dark frame will be important to help reduce some of the digital noise. If you don't do it, don't worry about it. I'll show you how Registrax uses it. Put yours on continuous shooting mode, and you can hit either a remote shutter release, and you can manually fire it. There's an intervalometer built into most DSLRs now. You can also get very inexpensive ones that will connect to your remote release, and you can program those to say, take a shot every 30 seconds, and it just will. And you can tell it how many to take, or just keep on going until you physically stop it. So the intervalometer in your cameras works great if you can set it up to just continually shoot. What you don't want to do, probably, my guess is, you don't want to sit there for an hour or an hour and a half, click every 30 seconds, click, you'd go crazy. You can if you want, if that's fun for you, but use the intervalometer, use the remote shutter release, but then it's basically hands off. You set it up, tell it, I want 250 shots, take one every 30 seconds, and it will just do it until it's taken those 250 shots. Works great. Really, you only need between 80 and 150 to get a decent effect. But the more you get, the longer those star trails will be, and the more light trails you'll see, as we saw in those examples, the more prominent they will be. Okay. All righty. So what you want to do is you're going to take one representative photo, whether it's the first, middle, the last, or all three, however you want to do it. But you're going to process them so that the stars stand out. You're going to edit them in Lightroom, get them looking the way you want, try and get a nice dark sky, get rid of any color cast that you've got, do any touch-ups on whatever's in the foreground or on the horizon, get them looking the way you want, then select all of your images and apply that same processing to all of your images. That way you've synchronized the adjustments that you made, and it should be applied to all of your images. You then export them all to JPEGs, high quality JPEGs, and I encourage you to do this yourself to prove it. I was always a proponent of set your JPEG at 100, quality of 100 so that it doesn't compress anything. And I had ended up with all of these JPEGs that were huge in size. And when I said, well, I'm just going to test my theory here, I'm going to save one image as a 100, quality of 100, 95%, 90, 85, 80, 75, 70, and look at them. And this is all within Lightroom. Export them with those different quality settings, and then look at them. And I found, looking at them better than one-to-one, doing some real pixel peeping, I found I could not see any difference between a 75 quality and a 100% quality. I tried in every kind of image I could imagine. I could not find a difference. I'm sure there are differences because the file size difference is dramatic. Huge savings in file size, which when you're putting it into another program like StarStax or Registax, either one of those, the smaller the file size is, the faster it's going to process. The more data you give it, the longer it's going to take. So if there's no quality difference in the two images, then go with, I usually set mine at about 80% and get decent sized files, and it has all the quality I need, all the detail that I need. So I'll show you, we're going to jump out to StarStax is the program I'm going to show you. And I'll show you some of the options. So let me go here. And there we go. Okay, so this is StarStax. And Registax works similarly. I'm just going to use StarStax because it's a standalone and does a great job. So double click on the executable, and there is also, this runs on a PC. I believe there's a Mac version also. There's other programs that will also work on a Mac, but they have a similar look. So it opens up in this, and it asks you to drop your sample images. So I have some sample images right here, and I'm going to drop all of these onto StarStax, right? Cha. So they're in numerical order, which is usually going to be the case. So these images are, these are the ones that are the images of the stars, and that is this first icon. Then there's this second icon where it says open dark frames. So when I open the dark frames, I have them labeled dark 1 through 5. These are 5 dark frames. And at this point, what you're going to do is there's this processing tab. Before I do that, I want to look at these options over here. I can choose either lighten, gap filling, darken, add, subtract, multiply, average, average plus, all kinds of options. And you'll want to experiment, see what works for you. I like the gap filling one because what it does, if you have, for instance, if when you're processing your images, you see that there's a jet flying through and there's a series of red streaks through that one image that it flew through during that 30-second exposure. What you want to do is just delete that one frame. Delete that one image. Now, that will leave a gap, a 30-second gap between one image and the next. But if you turn on this gap filling, what it will do is the program will look at the previous image, look at the next image, and fill in, assuming that we're talking star trails here, it will fill in any gaps that it finds, which is kind of nice. So gap filling works really well. I highly recommend using that setting. And then we'll look at it process both normally and then with comet mode turned on. You can also tell it to process them in reverse order so that the images will go in the other direction. And this is quite simple. It takes a little bit of time. This is only 25 images. So I'm going to hit this processing button here, and it will walk through the images, and it will build the star stack for us. And when it's all done, you can see on the left-hand side, it'll start walking through those images, and then it will subtract out. It took about 16.5 seconds. It will then subtract out the dark images. Now, with only 25, the star trails are not that long, and that's fine. But you can also say, I want to zoom in and see what it looks like. So it's nice and solid. If I had that gap filling turned off, then I would probably see some gaps. It depends on how long your exposure is. If I have a 15-second exposure uh, versus a 30-second exposure, I may see some gaps. A 30-second exposure usually ends up with more solid lines, okay? Because you're actually seeing the trail of the star before the next one picks up. Shorter exposures, you'll end up with more like a series of dots, and then you really need to use the gap filling mode, and it will fill those out, just like you did a 30-second exposure, okay? So when you're, you also have some options here that you can tell it the threshold, the brightness threshold. In other words, how dim a star do you want to have star trails on? You can set this very low, so it will take every star and it'll make a star trail. And then you can tell it how big a line do you want, okay? So you can see the result by hitting that processing button again, and it will reprocess them and come up with this image again based on those new settings. And I want to point out something here. It's just an interface thing on StarStax. Right now I'm in the Tools menu over here on the right. On the far right-hand side, over here on the right-hand side, there's the main menu that we choose the gap filling, then this Tools, and then this last one that is the StarStax help browser. And there's a whole help system, does a great job. But you want to be aware that this tools menu and the settings menu you get at them over here. Okay, so let me just see. Kathy Smith wants to come in. You're more than welcome. Here we go. Okay, so that's StarStax. Registax works very similarly. StarStax does a great job and does it very quickly. I'm going to turn on Comet mode so you can see what it looks like. And just for effect, I'm going to turn on long trails and then process it again and let it do its thing. This gives you a slightly different effect. It looks a little bit more, it's a little bit more interesting. That's the bottom line. So it processes those images, but it takes the earlier ones and makes them larger, and takes the later ones and gives them a tail, so that it ends up looking more like a comet. I'm going to, there we go. So it ends up looking more like a comet than without the comet trails turned on. Okay, and you'll see this, the more images you have, the more it can actually stretch that out, and you end up seeing what looks like a whole series of comets across the sky. All righty, David, here you go. Okay, so that's StarStax. Very simple, straightforward to use. No real gotchas in it. It does a quick job. The more images you have, it might take 20 or 30 minutes. When I was processing that 560 images in StarStax, I was doing some timing to just see how long it would take, and I've got a table here. I'll show you what goes on with it. When you're all done with this, you can then export the image, and it will it gives you this output image here that you can then export, and it will save it as a JPEG, and then you can do, that's your finished image. That's the combination of all the images. Okay, so that's StarStax. Let me just show you. Okay, so we talked about that. So this is with those 500 and some images. I took 250 and I did it. It broke it down. When you're doing only 80 with these different things turned on, it can take anywhere from 2 minutes up to, when you did 250, it'll take 10.5 minutes. And again, it also depends on your the processor you're using. It's very processor intensive, and the hard drive that you're using, because it's reading a lot of data. So it depends on your computer, but anywhere from a couple minutes to, if you're doing 500 image, it'll take 20, 22 minutes. So just be aware of that. But it's, in any case, for a normal set of 100, 150 images, it's 5 times every time you want to reprocess it. These are the settings that I used when I was processing these. So the gap filling, and have it subtract the dark images. the threshold, setting the threshold, and you can experiment with different ones. And again, this is your own, how you like it to look. So the option here for the threshold, the lower you set it, those dimmer stars will also get the treatment. What that does, though, is it clutters up the star field. You'll get more and more of those white lines. If you want to have that lessen so that only the prominent stars get trails, then you move that threshold over to the high end and experiment with several different settings until you get the look that you want. So if you look at these different examples, you can see the lower that threshold is, the more crowded that star field will look, and you'll get more star trails, but it may not be the look you're going for. Okay, the amount is how big a line do you want it to draw for each of those stars. More is going to make a bigger, thicker line versus less is going to make a thinner line. Okay. Usually do a test with 50 frames, and then you can give it all the pictures that you took, but get your settings down, whether you want to use dark frame or comet trails or not, and then give it all of your images, and you'll be able to see what it looks like. So this is no dark frame, no comet trails, 50 frames only, and this is the kind of look you see. How the gap filling will fill in some of those gaps, as it does, as it says. This is with no gap filling. This is 150 frames, same settings, no dark frame, no comet trails, but you get longer lines. You get more of an effect. So same thing, 150 frames with a dark frame and comet trails. This is that effect. I kind of like the look of this, where it looks like comets instead of just straight lines. So it gives you that star field look. This is 250 frames with a dark frame and with comet trails turned on. So you get even longer ones. The very, very last proportion turns out into giving it a much longer comet trail. It's a different look. So you process it the way you want. This is the lighten blending mode instead of the gap filling mode. To me, this was, I didn't quite get the point of this. It looks like a mess. To me, I mean, it's the same data, it's just processed differently. The other thing, and I made a note of this, because when you're using JPEGs, you need a lot of RAM. I did this on a machine with 96 gig of RAM, and it used almost half of it. So you may find your machine being brought to a crawl depending on how many images you give it. And when I was doing all 500 and some, it used almost all of that 96 gig of RAM. Okay, that'll be it for now then, and I'll see you guys when we can get out of this quarantine thing and start up again and have fun back at the Blue Barn. Okay? Take care, everybody.